Jake Barber. Okay, let's just jump into this. Jake Barber was featured on NewsNation recently. Came out with a story. They showed an egg-shaped craft crash retrieval video. So I'm just curious, your reaction, your first thoughts to all of this.
Wow. Thanks for having me on again, Patrick. It's great. It's great being here.
Yeah, I didn't even wait for you to say that. I just jumped right in. I'm so sorry.
It's all good. No, it's all, these are exciting times. Jake Barber, right off the bat, he is somebody who seems highly credible. He just comes across that way. Number one. Number two, I think all the positions he said he held is vetted. Here we're unvetted. Like he had several people come forward to testify to say, he is who he says he is. And if he's saying something, there's something to it. So there was a lot of support. The video came through another source, so it wasn't his video, but there's all just different pieces adding to the overall story of his testimony. And I'm really glad that the psionic aspect came out with that story. I wasn't sure if it was going to make it, and if it did, maybe it was just going to get a mention, but they went pretty in there. So, they're leading with the crash retrieval story, which is kind of where we are in the public discourse nowadays, which is actually amazing, right? Like even in 2017, the mainstream articles were not UFO crash retrieval. Now, several years later, if we see a UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering program in the headlines, it's no longer a surprise. So that's huge news to begin with. I think that Jake Barber's testimony, especially getting into the psionic aspect of it, is put us ahead in the disclosure conversation, like 10 or 20 years, jump into the future. People say they want disclosure. Look at their knee-jerk reaction to his story, right? They're like, oh, no, this is going to discredit. It's like, no, you wanted it, right? Here it is. So people forget that sometimes. They think what they want, they know what they want because they think what they want is what they expect. And that is not the case. And if you've been studying the UFO phenomenon for a long time, or you're familiar with some of the literature, or even what people call the invisible college, this is exactly the stuff that they've been talking about for decades: the human potential, remote viewing, interactions with non-human intelligence, right? So I'm super grateful that he had the courage to come forward, and he came forward with his identity, which again was originally not going to happen. It was just going to be a drop of information through anonymous sources with a lot of information all at once. And he decided to come forward with his name and his credentials, which again, some people don't think that was a smart idea. I think it was a great idea, at least, to his testimony.
No, I'm with you. I wanted to hear, I'm of that mindset, like bring it all out. If that's what the story is, let's just hear it and people will accept it or not. But I'd rather hear the whole thing instead of trying to keep some stuff back because they're not ready or this or that. Like, I'm with you. I say bring it out. If that's the story, then that's the story. I will say this. So you're kind of saying some things that are interesting to me, which is, it sounds like you have a little more knowledge about this guy and his story before the story came out, right? So you kind of knew about this essentially ahead of time.
I didn't know his name, but I was familiar with the different components of the story, and that it was related to this whistleblower and it was going to come out. So
why do you think he changed his mind to like put his name in all of that?
If I had to guess, I would say he was advised to do so via his certain advisors, right? There's several different of these factions or camps in the disclosure game, if I can call it that, right? Sure. They have different agendas. They have different methods of operating. They have different concerns, and they're all valid. So ultimately, I think that putting a name and face behind the testimony is more powerful, and it's what we need. And it's the symbol of transparency. It demonstrates transparency. rather than just another anonymous story of anonymous information, which we've gotten for the last 80 years, which has been helpful. It's been helpful in piecing together different things. And so
Sure.
back in those days, it kind of had to come out that way. Much
Sure.
more dangerous. I mean, again, you
Yeah.
still hear about retaliation and stuff today, but I think back when there was like no internet and you couldn't like put a spotlight on things like prior to the Disclosure Project and stuff, it was probably a much more dangerous idea to do something like that. So,
What are there any parts of his story that didn't come out that you know about?
um, only I've only heard speculation, so I don't want to comment on that and say like I know as an authority that of this and this, but
Sure.
from what I understand, yeah, there's other elements to it that will eventually come out.
Got it. Okay. No, very cool. And there are other, you know, people like him that are going to be
Oh,
coming out as well, right?
yeah,
Isn't that the deal?
allegedly, right? There's quite a number of
Sure.
them. Even yeah, people are saying even as soon as like weeks and months, and again, we'll see. They said they're kind
Sure.
of testing the waters. They want to see the public reaction. They want to see now. Okay, this guy came forward. Is there going to be like a reflex retaliation to this guy, and maybe other people won't come forward, or they'll stop there? Uh,
Sure.
Yeah. So they're testing the waters for sure.
Yeah. What about like what Dr. Stephen Greer says? Because I've been listening to his new podcast and him talking about his relationship with Jake Barber, and he's making a lot of claims about even the video, the crash retrieval video. He's kind of taking some shots at the piece itself and the producers and them not doing the right research. And, so I'm curious, like, does he actually have a connection? Do you know that? Like, does he actually have a connection to Jake Barber?
If Stephen Greer says that he has a connection to somebody, he's usually not lying. But you have to understand that when you're listening to Stephen Greer, that you're listening to Stephen Greer. Okay. So no, it's so true. If you know
That's
how to
funny.
listen to Stephen Greer, you'll jump 30 years ahead in this field, because
Okay, that's interesting.
he's all this stuff about special access programs and unacknowledged special access programs. He was talking about that in 1990s, right? 92, 93. He was having sit-ins with the sitting director of the CIA, the sitting director of the DIA. Those happened. Again, he was approached by the head of Army intelligence to use his psionic abilities to, to complement the remote viewing team and do that kind of work, which he denied. So people say, "Oh, that never happened." As for every source that I knew close to Stephen Greer confirms that had actually happened. Again, but when you listen to these stories, it has his spin on it, and that's what people don't like, and that's why people negate it, because it becomes larger than life when he explains it his way.
Sure.
Because it's all about him. Again, no offense to him, we wouldn't be where we were if it wasn't for the work he did all those decades and stuff. And again, he's more right than wrong in a ton of the stuff he says. Again, like I said, the special access program stuff, we didn't hear about that. Again, it didn't resurface really. Like Richard Dolan had noted all that stuff in his research. One of the few researchers who took note and wrote about it and whatnot. But we weren't listening. We didn't hear those terms again until after Lou came out. But again, Greer was talking about that in like 92 and 93 because he had the people from those programs come to him. He literally did. He had people from unacknowledged special access programs coming to him. He had military advisors who directed USAPs. Like all that stuff is true. But again, then you come into the issue of when you're listening to Stephen Greer, his spin on things. So there's also the aspect of, he became a target for good information, but also a target for disinformation. So what bad information was he fed because they knew he would regurgitate it in the public through books and lectures. Even if a majority of it was factual, all it takes is like one or two bits of the fake information to kind of spoil the whole thing, right? And discredit
100%.
his name. And
yeah, that's true. which
So,
probably happens a lot in the community, right? Not just him.
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Any high
You
profile.
know,
Look at Linda Moulton Howe, right? She was approached by
sure,
Doty.
sure.
Grant Cameron was, that's on the record.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. No, which makes it difficult, right? Even for if even the people behind the scenes, UFO researchers, have a difficult time. Imagine the viewer that's sitting at home watching this interview, right? Like the average person, all veterans that watch the show, essentially, for the most part, right? Like just trying to live their normal life and then tune into what's happening.
yeah.
It's got to be almost impossible to sort of filter out
Mm,
what's
yeah, a
real
little
and
bit,
not.
but they have the advantage of having degrees of separation.
Sure.
If you are yourself a targeted individual, like I believe Dr. Stephen Greer was or is, and among other people, you're in the web,
Sure.
so it makes it much
Yeah.
more sticky. It makes it much trickier to get your way out of that.
That's a fair point for sure, man. And I do want to make that clear that it's not just, I don't want to single out Dr. Stephen Greer. I think everyone at that level is susceptible to that. And I can't imagine having to work through that, to be honest with you. Like, yeah, because Jake Barber coming out and telling this story. Now, I do know that they're supposed to release all of, and maybe by the time this comes out, it's already happened, but on NewsNation, like his full interview, even with the other guys who, quote unquote, vouched for him. But look, let's just to play devil's advocate here for the conversation. Like there is some pushback from even veterans who are questioning sort of what his background actually is, and it was a little murky, and what are they saying, this or that. I can understand it. I'm not a veteran myself. You are, right? Or didn't
I'm
you
not.
serve
No,
in
no,
the?
no. I'm not. I'm not.
You're not a veteran.
No.
Okay.
I'm a veteran. I'm a veteran. I'm not a veteran.
Yeah. Hey, I love it. I don't want to get involved in that conversation of like questioning veterans and this. I leave that to other
If you
veterans to
have
question veterans.
those veterans that are standing side by side with him, and then you have somebody like Bilch, maybe
Yeah,
Blitch. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
yeah.
I always say that because I don't want to say the other word and missay.
Blitch, please.
You
I'm
have
just kidding.
somebody
Yeah.
like that putting their name behind this guy. I'm sorry. I'm just that's convincing.
That to you means
enough.
a lot.
That's
Sure.
convincing enough to me for sure. That guy is not going to put his name and reputation and his own service record in question to support some guy with a crazy story that's not going to help him anyway.
That's fair. That's a fair point, and it's good to talk about all different sides here for sure. What were there, when you were watching the piece, were there things like, I guess let's put it this way, what was the most fascinating part to that NewsNation piece that came out? Was it just that they mentioned the psionic aspect of it, and it seemed to be the majority of the piece itself? Was it that, or was there something specific? Or
For sure. I mean, the biggest part to me was that they were using psionics to interact with the UFO phenomenon. I think that's one of the biggest breakthroughs in this field in a long time. Like I said, I think it put us ahead 20 years into the disclosure conversation. That's like a big no-no. That's something that you'll read about in like Jacques Vallée's journals, or you'll hear about the NIDS or OSAP team doing these experiments behind the scenes, but they're not talking about it publicly, right?
Yeah.
But this is exactly to the root of the UFO phenomenon. It's getting into the deeper aspects of it. But the crash retrieval stuff is important, right? But all this like techno, the technological aspect, of course, it's a part of it, right? But that stuff is almost like a distraction compared to the deeper aspects of the UFO phenomenon, which is like, who are these non-human intelligence? What are they saying? What are the interactions? How are they communicating? And what is the nature of reality? In with all that in mind, that's the deeper stuff. It's the technology stuff is almost like a distraction. It's super important, and it's just as valid as the part of the conversation. But what I'm saying is, if they're willing to talk about crash retrievals and reverse engineering stuff, like what is the stuff they haven't been willing to talk about? And it's finally coming out in these kind of discussions.
Sure. I mean, look, I would be lying if I didn't say I'm extremely skeptical. Okay, I'm just being honest. That's just my opinion about it. I'm extremely skeptical of it because I start to see who's connected to who, and it 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 doesn't necessarily worry me. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm open minded and I'm willing to admit if I'm wrong down the line, like for sure. And I'm not really taking a stance one way or the other because I don't have all the information. So it's hard for me to definitively take a stance, one way or the other.